In 1948, a radio operator in the Malacca Strait reportedly received a distress call from the SS Ourang Medan. The message said that officers and crew members were dead. Then, after a burst of broken transmission, came the final reported words, "I die." No verified recording has survived, and the identity of the original operator remains uncertain. The message ended there. No calm update followed, no clear position was repeated, and no voice returned through the static. Somewhere along a heavily traveled maritime route, people had reached for outside help and then vanished from the airwaves. The silence that followed gave the story its first, enduring question. Why did the transmission stop at that exact moment? The reported message came in steps rather than as one complete statement. First, it referred to dead officers and crew members. Then came a line about the ship being surrounded by something unclear, followed by a short statement that death was near. The wording differs between later versions, which makes the exact sequence impossible to confirm. These details survive mainly through later accounts, including reports circulated in maritime publications and retold decades after the supposed transmission. No complete original radio log, authenticated telegram, or official inquiry has been established as the definitive source. That difference matters because each retelling can sharpen the terror while small details change, merge, or disappear. After the final signal, there was only silence. Someone aboard the ship had enough strength or enough time to send a warning, yet no second message explained the emergency. A radio transmission normally carried practical information such as a position, a mechanical failure, or a request for medical assistance. This one reportedly carried almost none. What happened between those last words and the arrival of help cannot be known with certainty. The interval may have lasted hours, but the surviving accounts do not provide a dependable timeline. That gap is the heart of the mystery, a few broken sentences on one side and an empty radio channel on the other, with no verified witness bridging them. The men aboard the Ourang Medan were not simply figures in a sea legend. They were workers far from land, carrying out routine duties on a merchant vessel that depended on engines, charts, weather reports, watches, and radio contact. Their jobs required coordination across the bridge, engine spaces, deck areas, and cargo compartments where a problem could spread quickly. They had homes, families, debts, plans, and ordinary fears. Some may have been responsible for navigation, machinery, cargo, or communications, while others handled the demanding physical work of a merchant ship. Whatever happened, it reached them in the middle of working lives that had been moving forward like any other day at sea until the reported emergency broke that routine. The Malacca Strait is a narrow water passage between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra. It links the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea and has long served ships traveling between Europe, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. Its constrained waters, busy traffic, reefs, shoals, and proximity to shore made reliable communication especially important. That made the distress call important beyond one ship. An emergency in the strait could threaten nearby vessels, disrupt a heavily used route, or require assistance from ships already in the area. A radio operator had to treat every broken signal as a possible warning to people still traveling through the passage, even when the message was incomplete or difficult to understand. The rescue ship named in the story was the Silver Star. According to later accounts, it received or responded to the emergency and began moving toward the drifting Ourang Medan. The name is one of the few recurring details in the legend, although the ship's exact identity, position, and documentary connection to the incident have never been firmly established. The cruel part was simple. The crew's last hope was not a battle or a storm that rescuers could clearly see. It was another vessel trying to reach them before the silence became permanent. Every mile between the two ships represented time in which an injured sailor might deteriorate, a fire might spread, or an unseen hazard might continue affecting everyone aboard. The Silver Star followed the distress information toward the Ourang Medan. The rescuers knew that people needed help, but they did not know what had caused the emergency or whether the danger was still present. They had no confirmed medical report, no reliable description of the ship's condition, and no clear assurance that anyone remained capable of answering a hail. That uncertainty changed the rescue into something more difficult than a normal search. The crew was not heading toward people who could explain a damaged engine, a collision, or a medical crisis. They were heading toward a ship that might contain the problem itself. Before anyone could provide aid, the rescuers would have to determine whether boarding was safe and whether the reported deaths were real. The Ourang Medan stopped answering. Its radio had gone quiet after a message about death, leaving the rescuers with no voice to guide them. No confirmed follow-up transmission supplied coordinates, a deck location, or a description of immediate hazards. The vessel had become a silent target in a busy sea lane, identifiable by name but largely unknowable in condition. Approaching such a ship carried a fear unlike the fear of reaching an ordinary stranded vessel. A silent door may hide a person who needs help, but at sea, silence can also mean that fire, toxic gas, flooding, or electrical failure has already taken control. Boarding officers would have to enter an unfamiliar environment while knowing that the first reported warning came from people who were no longer responding. Later accounts said the crew were found dead in different parts of the ship. They were described as having no clear injuries and no obvious signs of a struggle, with bodies reportedly lying in locations connected to their duties. However, these claims are not supported by a complete surviving investigation, authenticated photographs, or a reliable medical report that could establish how the deaths occurred. That is where the legend begins to separate from the record. The reported deaths are the center of the story, yet the evidence is thin. The original documents are missing or unverified, and the ship's identity and fate remain disputed. Explanations involving toxic cargo, poisonous gases, carbon monoxide, piracy, or later embellishment have all been proposed, but none has been conclusively demonstrated. The Silver Star followed the distress information toward the drifting Ourang Medan. As it came close, the freighter was still there, carried along by the sea, with no one answering its calls. The vessel had not vanished, sunk, or burned. It remained physically intact enough to approach, yet the silence coming from its deck suggested that whatever had happened had already ended. The rescue ship could inspect the Ourang Medan, but it could not ask the crew where the danger was or what had happened. The people who sent the final signal were no longer available to guide anyone through the ship. Every corridor, hatch, and compartment had to be approached without knowing whether the threat was gone or still present. The first reports described a grim discovery. Crew members were found dead in different parts of the vessel rather than gathered in one clearly identified disaster site. Their bodies were described as stiff, with faces said to show terror or agony. Those details became central to the legend, even though the surviving documentation is incomplete and later retellings do not always agree. That detail makes the story painful, even before the mystery begins. Each person may have faced the end alone or watched others fall, without having enough time to understand what was killing them. A sailor could have recognized that something was wrong only after another crew member collapsed, leaving almost no opportunity to warn the rest of the ship. The most haunting part of the legend is the claim that some bodies lay with fearful faces and eyes turned toward something unseen. The image has been repeated in books, articles, and broadcasts for decades, but it comes from the reported story, not from a complete and verified record. No universally accepted photographic file or official medical report settles how the bodies actually appeared. That difference matters. The picture of the crew staring at an invisible threat is powerful, yet the original evidence is too limited to prove exactly how the bodies were found or what their final moments looked like. A facial expression recorded by an observer is not the same as a clinical finding, and a later retelling can add certainty that the first account never possessed. The account does not describe clear wounds, an obvious fight, or a known attacker. There was no simple sign pointing to a person who had moved through the ship and harmed the crew. The absence of such evidence does not prove that violence was impossible, but it weakens the most straightforward human assailant explanation and leaves the deaths tied to the ship's environment. A violent event usually leaves clues behind, such as damaged equipment, scattered objects, blood, or defensive injuries. But a silent force can kill before anyone understands that danger is present, leaving investigators with bodies, silence, and questions instead of a clear enemy. Poison, contaminated air, or another sudden hazard could produce confusion without creating the visible disorder associated with a struggle. That is where the deepest fear in the story begins. The crew may have discovered too late that the air around them, the room they entered, or the ship they trusted had become unsafe. On a working freighter, danger could originate in a cargo hold, an engine space, a chemical container, or a poorly ventilated compartment, turning ordinary shipboard routines into lethal exposure. A sailor could reach for a door, climb below deck, or begin a normal task without knowing that the next breath might be dangerous. On the Ourang Medan, the threat described in the legend was frightening because it offered no warning that the crew could see. There was no visible attacker to avoid, no locked boundary to mark the danger, and perhaps no time to interpret the first symptoms. One possible explanation was a chemical accident. Dangerous cargo or leaking chemicals might have released poisonous fumes, harming people who breathed the air while leaving little visible damage to the ship. If containers ruptured or incompatible substances reacted, the first signs could have been irritation, dizziness, weakness, or confusion before the crew lost the ability to respond. The theory was never proven, but it gave the mystery a physical cause. Instead of an unseen attacker, the danger could have been a substance spreading through the vessel. That explanation still requires evidence about the cargo, ventilation, weather, temperature, and location of the bodies, none of which has been established in a complete and independently verified chain of records. That possibility also changes how the dead crew are remembered. A sailor may have entered a room to do a routine job, taken one breath, and collapsed before he could explain what was wrong. If the exposure acted quickly, another person finding him might have mistaken the collapse for an injury, entered to help, and suffered the same fate. Another crew member might have followed, unaware of the first man's fate. If the danger had no smell or clear sign, people could have walked toward it while trying to help. In a confined ship, instinctive rescue efforts could therefore spread the exposure from one compartment to another, creating a sequence of deaths that looked mysterious after the survivors were gone. Fumes can move through enclosed rooms and collect in lower parts of a ship. If the air becomes poisonous, people may lose strength quickly, making it hard to climb, call for help, or reach the radio. A person who recognizes the danger may still be unable to cross a passageway, open a hatch, or remain conscious long enough to send a useful location. This is a general safety principle used to test the chemical theory, not proof of what happened aboard the Ourang Medan. It shows how an enclosed ship could become dangerous, but it does not identify the substance or confirm the chain of events. Without reliable samples, cargo manifests, autopsy findings, and a documented inspection, the mechanism remains a possibility rather than a conclusion. Some versions of the story name chemicals such as cyanide. Yet no verified cargo record has been produced to prove that cyanide was aboard the ship. The claim is especially difficult to evaluate because the vessel's identity, ownership, route, distress transmission, and surviving documentation have all been questioned by researchers investigating whether the event was reported accurately at all. The idea survives because it could fit sudden deaths without visible injuries. Still, it leaves major questions unanswered, including how the chemical entered the air, why the crew reacted as reported, and why the evidence never became clear. Those gaps are not minor details. They determine whether the Ourang Medan was a real maritime disaster, a distorted report, or a legend built from fragments that can no longer be checked. Another theory points to nitroglycerin or to some other unstable chemical that may have been aboard. Nitroglycerin can react violently under the wrong conditions, so the idea tries to explain both a dangerous ship and a crew that died without clear wounds. But the record does not confirm that nitroglycerin was part of the cargo. There is no trusted cargo list, no clear blast evidence, and no complete report showing how such a chemical could have caused the deaths. The theory fits some details, but fitting details is not the same as proving a cause. A chemical accident could also explain a cruel kind of fear. The crew might have sensed that something was wrong without knowing where the danger came from. In a closed ship, one person's panic could spread, while another tried to reach the radio and call for help. That possibility makes the story feel less like a puzzle and more like a human emergency. The crew may have faced danger they could not see, name, or escape, but the known record does not tell us what anyone did in those final moments. The distress call matters because it gives the disaster a rough timeline. Someone aboard the Ourang Medan managed to send a message before communication ended. That means the ship was not simply found empty. A person inside had reached outward before the silence returned. Yet the message gives us only a narrow view of the event. It shows that fear or danger was present, but it does not identify the source. A radio signal can preserve a warning while losing the story behind it. The reported final words were, "I die." Those words became the emotional center of the mystery because they sound personal, sudden, and final. They seem less like a formal report than the last moment of a person who believed help would not arrive in time. But even that famous ending must be treated with care. The record may have been copied imperfectly, repeated by people who were not present, or changed as the story passed from one account to another. The words remain haunting, but we cannot know whether every part of the signal was heard exactly as later versions claim. The last known movement is simpler than the legend. A distress signal was received, the Silver Star moved toward the Ourang Medan, and the freighter was found drifting. Beyond those basic facts, the surviving accounts become less certain. The rescuers came expecting to find living people in need of help. Instead, they faced a silent ship and a dead crew. The distress call had worked well enough to bring help closer, but not soon enough to reveal what had happened. That failure carries its own weight. A warning had crossed the water, yet the people who sent it could not explain the danger or wait for rescue. The ship had asked to be found, and when it was found, the answers were already gone. The reported lack of visible injuries changed the questions investigators had to ask. It made an ordinary attack harder to accept, but it did not prove that poison was involved. Suffocation, sudden illness, or a misunderstood accident remained possible explanations, not confirmed findings. The same detail also leaves room for other causes. A chemical release might harm people without leaving a wound. A problem with the air might do the same. But without medical evidence, each idea remains a possibility built around missing information. The famous accounts describe faces marked by terror and bodies that appeared stiff. Those descriptions have shaped the story for decades, but they are not the same as a medical examination. No complete report tells us exactly what happened to every body. We also do not have a reliable account of where every crew member was found. Small details like position, clothing, and signs of illness could have helped separate one theory from another. Without them, the bodies become part of the legend more easily than part of a proven case. That is the cruel limit of the Ourang Medan mystery. The message suggests a disaster. The drifting ship confirms that something went wrong, and the reported bodies suggest a sudden end. But the surviving record never securely connects those facts to one cause. What unsettles people most is not simply that the crew may have died, but that their final condition was never documented with enough precision to be understood. Were the bodies showing signs of poisoning, oxygen deprivation, disease, exposure, or ordinary changes after death? Did every man die at the same time, or did some survive longer than others? The surviving stories do not answer these questions. They preserve an image of sudden terror while losing the medical details that could have turned that image into evidence. That uncertainty leaves the crew suspended between history and folklore. They were real sailors on a real vessel, facing a danger that may have been chemical, environmental, criminal, or entirely different from the popular theories. Yet the absence of verified examinations means their suffering cannot be reconstructed with confidence. The mystery endures because the last human evidence is also the least reliable. A few reported bodies, an abandoned ship, and a warning that ends before anyone explains what happened. An unexplained death leaves a special kind of pain. Families need to know what happened, where it happened, and what took a loved one away. They look for a death certificate, a witness statement, a medical finding, or even a final message. Without that answer, grief has nowhere to settle, and every unanswered detail can keep the loss feeling unfinished. The Ourang Medan story stays alive for the same reason. It denies both the crew and everyone who hears the tale the comfort of a final explanation. In accounts that appeared decades after the supposed incident, the men were said to be dead across the ship with expressions of terror and a final distress message. Yet the cause of death remained hidden. The danger may not have ended when the rescuers reached the ship. In the commonly told account, the vessel soon became unsafe, making a full investigation difficult. Some versions describe smoke, fire, or a sudden explosion, but none of those details has been established by a complete official report. They belong to the story as reported, not to a confirmed sequence of events. If the ship could no longer be explored safely, important evidence may have vanished with it. Damaged rooms, cargo, instruments, radio equipment, and human remains could not be examined under controlled conditions. Investigators might have lost the chance to collect tissue samples, inspect ventilation systems, or compare the cargo manifest with the physical contents. A mystery grew where a proper report should have been. The crew of the Silver Star faced a terrible choice. They had reportedly come to save people after receiving the Ourang Medan's distress signal, yet they also had to learn what had killed the first crew. The same vessel that called for help might still hold poisonous cargo, unstable chemicals, electrical hazards, or some other unseen danger. Rescue could become a second disaster. Rescue work is built on urgency, but investigation demands caution. Every step toward the Ourang Medan could protect the truth or put more lives at risk. The rescuers were not entering an empty wreck with obvious damage and known hazards. They were entering a threat they did not understand, without reliable information about the cargo, the crew's condition, or the source of the emergency. That is the central problem with the evidence. The ship, the bodies, and the records do not form a complete trail. Each part is said to exist, but the full chain connecting them is missing. There is no securely documented sequence showing the original message, the location, the rescue attempt, the condition of the vessel, the examination of the dead, and the final disposition of the wreck. If the vessel was lost, or if the account was never formally preserved, later investigators were left with fragments. A distress signal could be remembered by a sailor, printed in a newspaper, or repeated in a maritime magazine. A rescue could be retold years afterward, but without original radio papers, port records, insurance files, or an official inquiry, final facts became harder to separate from later changes. Retelling can slowly reshape a story. The faces become more frightening, the signal becomes more exact, and the ship becomes more mysterious with every version. An abbreviated message can acquire a precise time. A vague report of dead sailors can become a detailed tableau. Details that may once have been uncertain can begin to sound like proven facts, simply because several later writers repeat them. That does not make every part of the story false. It means each detail must be weighed by its source and by the evidence behind it. A repeated claim is still only a claim when no surviving log, newspaper from the relevant period, government file, or identified witness confirms it. Historical investigation depends on provenance, who recorded the information, when they recorded it, and whether the record can be independently checked. Behind the legend were sailors who had families, duties, and ordinary lives before the final voyage. They would have needed wages, identification papers, medical records, and relationships at ports along the route. Their deaths can be hidden by talk of cursed ships, supernatural forces, and twisted faces. The mystery should not turn them into monsters or symbols. They were workers whose identities deserve more than a frightening anecdote. Uncertainty should create compassion for people who died without a known explanation. It should remind us that the most important question is not whether the ship was haunted. It is whether real people were placed in danger, what they were carrying, what warnings they received, and why no clear account remained. Even an incomplete historical case still concerns human lives, not merely an entertaining maritime legend. A strong ship record would normally leave several marks. There would be proof that the vessel existed, records of its owner and route, a cargo list, port clearances, radio logs, rescue reports, insurance documents, and a clear final account. Maritime authorities, shipping companies, insurers, and port officials could each preserve separate pieces. Together, those records could show where the ship sailed, what happened, and when. The Ourang Medan mystery is troubled by gaps in that chain. Some pieces appear in later accounts, while other pieces are missing or hard to verify. A magazine article may preserve a dramatic message but omit the original document. A witness may remember a rescue but provide no date or coordinates. The fewer records that survive, the more space there is for error, rumor, translation problems, and invention. The hardest challenge to the legend is the lack of official maritime records. Some people have questioned whether the SS Ourang Medan existed in the way the story says, particularly because a ship with that name and a documented wreck has been difficult to establish through accessible archives. That question does not prove the tale was fake, but it changes the investigation. Existence, ownership, registration, and voyage history must be tested before the deaths can be explained. Instead of asking only what killed the crew, we must also ask what can be proven about the ship itself. Was the name recorded correctly or changed through translation and retelling? Was the voyage documented by a port authority, insurer, or shipping registry? Were the distress call and rescue preserved in an official file? Without those answers, even the beginning of the story remains uncertain, and theories about poison, cargo, or sabotage rest on unstable ground. Missing records can wound ordinary families in the same way. When a person disappears and no papers show where they were, loved ones may be forced to live with several possible stories. A hospital record might suggest one outcome, a witness might suggest another, and a delayed report might leave both unresolved. Each possibility offers a little hope, and each one can reopen the pain when new information fails to appear. The Ourang Medan's missing record creates that same wound on a larger scale. A ship may have vanished from the archives, but the questions surrounding its crew did not vanish with it. They remained, passed from one account to another, moving through books, magazines, websites, and conversations. The story keeps waiting for evidence that may no longer exist, while the absence of proof becomes part of the mystery itself. The safest place to begin is with what can actually be claimed. Reports place the SS Ourang Medan in or near the Malacca Strait in 1948. They also describe a distress call, a rescue ship called the Silver Star, and a crew found dead aboard. Beyond those points, the story becomes less certain because no complete official file has settled the ship's identity, cargo, route, or final condition. The chemical spill theory is also part of the record, but it remains a theory. Details about twisted faces, frozen bodies, and the crew's final words come from later accounts, and those accounts do not all agree. They may preserve real events, changed details, or both. Some versions place the signal in June 1948, while others blur the date and location. That uncertainty carries its own kind of pain. Death ends a life, but an unclear death can keep questions alive for decades. Families are left wondering what happened in the final minutes, whether anyone understood the danger before it was too late, and whether the radio message preserved the crew's actual words. Without names, medical records, or confirmed remains, even mourning becomes tied to speculation. For the men aboard the ship, the worst moment may not have been the end itself. It may have been the time before it, when something was wrong but no one could name it. They may have felt sick, trapped, or afraid, while help was still far away and the cause remained hidden. If the emergency spread quickly, ordinary actions like opening a hatch or crossing a passage could have become fatal. The chemical theory begins with a simple possibility. A dangerous substance may have been stored aboard the ship, perhaps in cargo holds or containers, never conclusively identified. If it leaked, it could have spread through the air, or changed into fumes that people could breathe without seeing. The theory depends on an unverified cargo, but it offers a mechanism for danger arriving without a visible attacker. Those fumes may then have moved through closed rooms and narrow passageways. A crew member could have entered one area, taken a breath, and fallen before reaching fresh air. Others may have faced the same danger without knowing where it came from. On a working vessel, ventilation systems, doors, stairwells, and enclosed compartments could have carried contamination beyond its original source. The theory becomes powerful because it connects several parts of the story. It could explain sudden deaths, a lack of clear wounds, and a distress call sent during a fast-moving crisis. It might also fit later reports that the crew appeared terrified. A toxic exposure could create confusion, breathing failure, and collapse, although those symptoms alone would not identify a particular chemical. But a theory that fits several details is not the same as proof. A key can look right and still fail to open the lock. Without direct evidence, the chemical idea remains an explanation that may fit the story, not a final answer. There is no authenticated examination showing that a specific substance caused the deaths, and no verified chain of evidence connecting cargo to the emergency. Important pieces are missing. There is no confirmed cargo list showing what dangerous material was aboard. There is no complete chemical test from the scene, no secure medical report, and no full record showing exactly how fumes could have moved through the ship. Even the vessel's ownership, construction history, and route are difficult to establish with confidence in surviving accounts. That leaves the theory standing, but only on uncertain ground. It may explain part of the mystery while leaving other parts untouched. A possible cause is not the same as a proven cause. It does not establish why the distress signal was worded as reported, whether the ship was legally documented under that name, or what happened between the first emergency and the arrival of the Silver Star. Still, the story returns to the radio operator. Whatever the exact words were, the distress call was an attempt to reach people beyond the ship. Someone used the radio to make the danger known, even as the crew's own chance of survival may have been fading. In maritime emergencies, that act requires power, equipment, training, and enough awareness to transmit a warning. That act matters because it was not a legend. It was a human response to danger, at least according to the accounts that preserved it. In a place surrounded by water, the operator tried to send a warning across the empty distance, trusting strangers to hear it. The message represented a narrow connection between an isolated crew and the wider maritime network. The signal tells us that fear and urgency were present, or at least that later reports remembered them that way, but it does not tell us who sent the message or what that person believed was happening. A radio transmission can record words and timing, yet still leave the central question unanswered. Whether the operator recognized poison, illness, mechanical failure, violence, or something else entirely. We do not know whether the operator understood the cause. We do not know whether other crew members were already dead. We also do not know whether the final message was copied word for word or changed as it passed from one account to another. That distinction matters because a fragment repeated for years can acquire details that were never present in the original transmission. Other explanations remain possible. Illness could have spread quickly through the crew. A lack of breathable air could have made people collapse. A violent event might also have happened, even if later reports failed to show a clear trace. Carbon monoxide, contaminated provisions, equipment failure, or panic could each account for selected details, but none has been demonstrated from reliable physical evidence. None of these ideas can be turned into fact from the story alone. Each one explains some details and struggles with others. That is why the mystery cannot be solved by choosing the most frightening answer. The strongest explanation must account for the radio call, the reported condition of the crew, the ship's disappearance from reliable records, and the absence of verifiable forensic evidence. The Ourang Medan was, first of all, a workplace. The men aboard trusted the walls, the air, the tools, and the daily routine to keep them alive. Ships are built around that trust. Crews depend on navigation systems, engine rooms, cargo procedures, watches, radios, and one another, because the sea offers little margin when ordinary equipment fails. When the ship itself becomes the danger, that trust turns into a trap. The crew may have faced the threat in the very rooms meant to shelter them, with no safe place to run and no clear way to tell the outside world what had gone wrong. The tragedy, if the core account is true, was not only that help came too late, but that the ship's own systems may have become part of the danger. At sea, the Ourang Medan was never a fixed crime scene. In the 1947 account, the ship moved through waters near the Indonesian archipelago, then allegedly drifted while its crew lay dead. Waves altered its position, weather changed the condition of the deck, and the vessel itself was reportedly lost before investigators could preserve a complete record of what happened. Water could damage papers, spread stains, wash residue from metal, and erase marks left by tools or cargo. Distance limited the number of witnesses, while wartime disruption and poor communications made records difficult to compare. Once the ship disappeared, investigators could not return to inspect its rooms, instruments, cargo spaces, or bodies. Every missing detail narrowed the path to the truth. Those gaps helped create a darker theory. Later tellings suggested that the vessel carried secret cargo, that a government had intervened, or that officials deliberately silenced anyone who knew the cause of death. Some versions connected the mystery to chemical warfare materials, while others implied sabotage or an illegal military shipment. Each edition made the story more dramatic, but not necessarily more reliable. There is no verified proof of secret cargo, government action, or an organized effort to hide the truth. No authenticated manifest has established what the ship carried, and no confirmed official file demonstrates a suppression order. The theory grew instead from frightening reported details, combined with records that were missing, weak, privately repeated, or difficult for later researchers to authenticate. A missing record creates a blank space. That blank may result from poor record-keeping, wartime censorship, a damaged archive, translation problems, or simple loss over decades. Yet when a ship's name, registry, route, and final report cannot be independently matched, the blank can feel deliberate. The absence of paperwork begins to resemble evidence of a hidden decision. Then fear does the rest. The absence of proof becomes proof that someone removed the proof, and soon the silence itself is treated as evidence of a hidden force. A disputed radio message becomes a suppressed transmission. An uncertain cargo becomes contraband. A missing investigation becomes a cover-up. A story about incomplete records starts sounding like a story about secrets. This is how a mystery can become more certain than its evidence. Once the surviving material is repeated in books, magazines, documentaries, and online summaries, each retelling can make an uncertain detail sound established. A phrase attributed to the crew may be shortened, translated, or dramatized, while the warning about missing documentation quietly disappears. When facts stop, the mind supplies an answer. Yet a confident answer can erase the crew as real people. It can replace their unknown final hours with a neat tale involving poison, murder, or forbidden cargo. Even though no verified survivor described the event and no complete forensic examination is available. The limits of the evidence may be frustrating, but acknowledging those limits is more honest than inventing certainty for the dead. The broken chain begins with proof that the ship itself existed under the name Ourang Medan. Then comes proof of its voyage, followed by the original distress record, the full rescue account associated with the Silver Star, medical findings, and a complete official report. Researchers would also need a dated registry entry, a traceable crew list, and documents linking the vessel to its reported location. Each missing link weakens the next claim. Without a reliable voyage record, the setting is harder to confirm. Without the original message, the famous words are harder to test for exact wording, translation, and transmission quality. Without medical findings, the reported posture and appearance of the bodies cannot establish a cause. Without a final report, even the sequence of events remains uncertain. The rescuers would have wanted simple answers. What did you smell? Where did the danger begin? Did anyone see smoke, liquid, flames, or an intruder? Was the radio operator still alive when the message was sent? Were the engines running, and had the crew opened or damaged any cargo? Those questions could have separated an accident from an attack. But no later testimony settled them. No one could answer them later. Every first-hand account ended with the crew, leaving later writers and investigators to speak for people who could no longer correct the record. Even the role of the Silver Star remains surrounded by uncertainty because the surviving story does not provide a complete, independently verified rescue log, engineering report, crew statement, or chain of custody for physical evidence. The story gives the crew faces turned toward terror, but no clear object of fear. A storm, an attacker, or a fire can leave recognizable traces. Poisonous air may not. Yet even the account of those expressions is uncertain because we do not know how closely later versions matched what rescuers truly found. Reports may have been translated, condensed, or embellished after the alleged encounter. That uncertainty makes the story more disturbing, not less. The crew may have faced a danger that could not be seen, but we cannot be certain that every famous detail survived unchanged. A body's position can be altered by movement, heat, waves, or rescue attempts. A description written years later cannot automatically serve as a forensic observation made at the scene. A sudden chemical accident remains one of the strongest practical explanations offered. It fits an invisible danger, a confined ship, and deaths that may have happened quickly. Possible mechanisms include toxic fumes from damaged cargo, chemical reactions in a poorly ventilated hold, or gases displaced through the vessel. But no authenticated cargo record, sample, autopsy, or laboratory analysis confirms that mechanism. The deeper mystery may therefore be two mysteries joined together. One asks how the crew may have died, whether through poisoning, fire, mechanical failure, violence, or another maritime accident. The other asks whether later tellings connected a real event with details that can no longer be checked. Separating those questions prevents a compelling narrative from being mistaken for surviving evidence. Both possibilities must be held at once. The crew may have been real people caught in a deadly event, while the legend surrounding them may contain errors, added drama, or invention. The ship may have transmitted a distress call, or that call may have been misremembered. A vessel may have been found abandoned, or the entire account may have grown from an unverified report. Until a dated log, radio record, wreck site, or verified survivor account emerges, the SS Ourang Medan cannot be treated as a solved case. The most responsible conclusion is narrower and more unsettling. A vessel may have suffered a genuine catastrophe in waters around Indonesia, but the surviving evidence is too weak to establish exactly which vessel it was, when the deaths occurred, or what caused them. Poisonous cargo, fire, mechanical failure, violence, and later embellishment remain competing possibilities, not confirmed facts. The mystery endured because its central evidence disappeared, leaving behind a chain of retellings in which uncertainty became legend. The SS Ourang Medan now rests in the uneasy space between history and folklore. A reported distress call placed the ship in 1948 somewhere near the Malacca Strait and connected the case to a real vessel called the Silver Star. That combination of a named ship, a specific year, and a recognizable maritime route gives the legend an appearance of solid documentation. But the records that could secure the story are missing or uncertain. No universally accepted original radio log, crew manifest, insurance file, port document, or official investigation has emerged to settle the account. That leaves space for honest confusion, later exaggeration, mistranslation, or details that may have been added long after the event. The most respectful way to remember the crew is also the simplest. People were reported dead after a distress call, and their deaths never received a fully secure explanation. Even the number of people aboard, their identities, and the precise location of the vessel remain difficult to establish from surviving evidence. We cannot know what they thought in their final moments. We cannot give them invented fears, invented words, or a final scene that the surviving evidence cannot prove. Later retellings describe rigid bodies, staring faces, and strange postures, but those images belong to an uncertain narrative, not to a verified medical or rescue report. The case still matters because it raises clear questions about safety at sea. If a silent chemical hazard caused the deaths, ships would need accurate cargo records, safe storage, working communication, ventilation procedures, protective equipment, and rescue plans. A dangerous atmosphere could disable a crew before anyone recognized the source or reached the radio. Those are lessons suggested by the theory, not confirmed failures aboard the Ourang Medan. The missing evidence prevents us from turning a warning into a proven account of what happened. Without a verified cargo manifest, inspection record, autopsy, or salvage report, the proposed mechanism remains possible rather than demonstrated. The deepest fear in the story feels familiar even now. Danger does not always arrive with flames, smoke, or a loud blast. Toxic gases, oxygen loss, fire byproducts, and contaminated air can spread through enclosed compartments while leaving the deck apparently calm, giving a crew very little time to identify the threat. Sometimes the first warning is a desperate call made when there is almost no time left to understand the threat. By then, the people who need help may already be losing the ability to explain what is happening. A broken transmission, a fading voice, or an incomplete position could turn a survivable emergency into a search with almost no usable direction. The strongest facts are the reported 1948 distress call, the Malacca Strait, the SS Ourang Medan, the Silver Star, and the crew who were said to be dead. These details give the mystery its firmest shape. They establish the outline repeated across later accounts, even though they do not independently prove the event or connect every piece of evidence. The frozen faces and exact final wording require more care. They appear in later versions of the story, but their original source is not secure enough to treat every detail as proven. The famous final message is often repeated as though it came from a preserved transcript, yet no authenticated document has established its complete wording, timing, or sender. An original radio log could show who sent the signal and what was actually heard. A cargo list might reveal whether dangerous chemicals were aboard. A ship registry could confirm the vessel's ownership, route, construction, and operating history, while a port record might show when the ship departed and whether it was officially reported missing. A medical report could show how the crew died, while a rescue record might confirm whether the ship's identity was ever fully checked. Each missing document leaves one more question open. Without those records, investigators cannot reliably separate first-hand observation from newspaper repetition, translated testimony, maritime rumor, or embellishment introduced by later writers. Behind the famous story was still a person at a radio. That person could not bring the Silver Star close enough to solve the danger, could not explain what had happened, and could only send words into the strait. Whether the transmission was authentic, distorted, or later reconstructed, the human situation imagined behind it remains one of extreme isolation. The call was a small act of courage surrounded by helplessness. It reached another ship, but it did not bring back the people who made it. In any genuine maritime emergency, sending a distress signal requires someone to recognize danger, reach the equipment, transmit under pressure, and hope another vessel can interpret the message before the opportunity disappears. The most balanced answer is plain. A chemical accident is a believable explanation for a sudden disaster that could spread through the air and kill without warning, but the true story cannot be proven from the surviving account. Other possibilities, including fire, cargo decomposition, oxygen deprivation, carbon monoxide, or a fabricated report, also remain difficult to confirm or eliminate. The mystery survives because practical clues point in one direction while historical gaps point in another. Chemical exposure can explain rapid incapacitation, yet the story lacks a verified medical finding. Missing documents can explain uncertainty, yet uncertainty alone does not prove a conspiracy. Neither side is strong enough to close the case. Chemicals may explain the unseen danger, but there is no secure proof that chemicals caused the deaths. A cover-up may explain the missing records, but there is no solid evidence that anyone hid the truth. The same discipline applies to every proposed explanation. A mechanism must be supported by documents, physical evidence, or testimony that can be independently checked. A false or changed story may explain why the records disappeared, yet it cannot fully explain why the distress narrative endured for so long. Every theory solves one part of the mystery and leaves another part behind. The SS Ourang Medan remains compelling not because one explanation has won, but because the evidence ends before the final answer begins. The cost of turning the Ourang Medan into a legend is easy to miss. Each retelling can make the dead crew seem like symbols in a ghost story, instead of workers who expected to finish their journey and return home. Every reported body belonged to someone with a name, a family, and an ordinary reason for being at sea. That is the lasting harm of an uncertain story. The less we know about the men, the more room there is for dramatic images to replace them. Mystery can preserve memory, but it can also erase the people it claims to remember. The most durable result is cultural, not proven scientific. The Ourang Medan became a warning about the danger of accepting a striking tale before checking its records, its ship, and its source. The lesson applies far beyond one lost vessel. The story also shows why ship records matter. A cargo list, a radio log, and a crew roster can turn fear into evidence. Without them, later investigators are left to separate what was recorded from what was added by memory. For the families, the loss would have had a quieter shape than the legend suggests. There was no confirmed list of victims that could give every relative a clear ending. The concrete consequence was uncertainty, carried by people who had no grave, no full report, and no trusted account of what happened. For workers at sea, that uncertainty has a familiar edge. A ship can be both a workplace and a sealed space, far from help when something goes wrong. The men aboard the Ourang Medan were not chasing a mystery. They were doing a dangerous job under conditions most people on land never saw. The legend grew after the event, but the human cost came first. Before newspapers, books, and later retellings shaped the tale, people had already lost their lives in a place where rescue depended on distance, weather, and a working radio. That pattern connects the case to a wider change in maritime history. In 1947, the Strait of Malacca was a busy route linking ports across Southeast Asia. Yet a distress call could still leave rescuers with more questions than answers. The reported signal from the Ourang Medan showed how thin the line could be between contact and silence. A later account tied the rescue to the Silver Star and placed the abandoned ship near the strait. But the record did not settle the ship's identity, the cargo, or the condition of the bodies. That gap changed the assumption that a radio message alone could establish the truth of a disaster. The aftershock was not a new discovery, it was a loss of confidence. A message could sound precise and still rest on a story that had never been fully checked. One question remains beyond what the surviving record can settle. Did the Ourang Medan truly exist in the form later accounts describe? The answer cannot be secured by the distress message alone because the original documents needed to test it have not been produced. Even if the ship existed, another question remains attached to it. Did a sudden chemical event kill the crew, or did later writers join separate details into one powerful account? The evidence allows suspicion, but it does not allow certainty. The durable consequence is a change in how the mystery should be handled. It belongs beside other historical claims that require source checks, not inside the same category as a confirmed wreck with a complete investigation. That distinction protects the truth without pretending the story has no value. For audiences, the concrete loss is the habit of seeing only the final image. A row of bodies, a silent deck, and a broken message are easier to remember than unknown names. But when the names disappear, the story becomes less human even as it becomes more famous. That is the wider aftershock of the case. It changed the way many people imagine danger at sea, from a visible storm or attack to an enemy that leaves no clear mark. The fear comes from the gap between the final message and the missing proof. The account linked the event to the waters near Indonesia in 1947, and later retellings gave the Silver Star a role in the rescue. Yet no confirmed finding has closed the distance between that account and the historical record. The mystery endured because the image was stronger than the evidence. What cannot be settled is not only what killed the crew, it is whether there was ever one complete event behind all the surviving details. A chemical accident may explain the sudden danger, but it cannot prove the ship's identity or recover the missing records. The same uncertainty reaches into public memory. A story can survive for decades without gaining new evidence, simply because each telling repeats the parts people find hardest to forget. Repetition can make an unverified account feel solid, even when its foundation remains thin. The lasting result is not a solved case, but a gap in the record. The earliest widely cited accounts appeared in 1940s maritime reporting, yet they do not establish a registration number, flag state file, owner, port of departure, or complete crew list. No verified wreck has been identified, and no surviving logbook, cargo manifest, distress transcript, or autopsy report has been produced. Later retellings often attach the story to the Strait of Malacca and to a vessel called the Silver Star, but those details remain disputed, and no confirmed investigation by a maritime authority has closed the chain of evidence. For historians, that leaves the Ourang Medan outside the firm history of maritime disasters, studied as an unconfirmed story rather than a proven event. Somewhere in that gap, the last radio signal still hangs unanswered, carried away across an empty sea. The reported messages are usually reduced to a sequence of distress calls, an accusation that the crew had died, and a final transmission ending in unintelligible code, but the original radio operator's notes have never been authenticated. There is no agreed timestamp, no independently verified receiving station record, and no physical evidence connecting those words to a ship later found abandoned. That missing chain matters. Without it, the signal cannot securely identify the vessel, explain the deaths, or prove that the broadcast occurred at all. The mystery survives not because one answer has been hidden, but because the evidence needed to test every answer was never secured.